I never thought I would be the person to sit in the back of my own father's multi-million-dollar charity gala, listening to him describe me to a room full of donors as his greatest disappointment and a worthless, uneducated leech. But that's exactly where I found myself last Friday night. He didn't know I was there, of course, and he certainly didn't know that the anonymous donor who had just saved his prestigious foundation from bankruptcy was the very daughter he'd spent 15 years mocking for flipping burgers. I watched him raise a glass of vintage champagne, laughing with his high society friends about how some people are born to lead while others, like his own flesh and blood, are destined to fail because they lack the intellectual stamina to make something of themselves. It was the ultimate betrayal delivered with a smile, and in that moment, I realized that the man who raised me never actually knew me at all. Was I wrong for letting him humiliate himself so publicly before I finally revealed the truth? Or would you have done the exact same thing if your own father treated you like garbage for over a decade? I really need to know if I crossed a line, or if this was the justice I'd been waiting for since I was 18 years old. To understand how we got to that ballroom, you have to understand the dynamic of the Sterling family. My father, Richard, is a man who measures human worth in degrees and tax brackets. He's a world-renowned surgeon who transitioned into the even more lucrative world of medical tech and philanthropy. Growing up, my life wasn't about being a child. It was about being a trophy. If I didn't get a perfect score on a math test, I was lazy. If I wanted to spend my weekends painting instead of shadowing him at the hospital, I was unfocused. My brother, Julian, followed the script perfectly. He went to Harvard, became a corporate lawyer, and married a woman whose family tree probably has its own zip code. I, on the other hand, was the problem child. Not because I did drugs or got into trouble, but because I was neurodivergent. I struggled with the rigid, traditional classroom setting, and my dyslexia made standard testing a nightmare. Instead of helping me, Richard saw it as a personal insult to his superior genetics. He told me constantly that I was slow, and that I'd be lucky to find a job cleaning the floors of the buildings he owned. When I decided not to go to the Ivy League school, he'd essentially bribed my way into, and instead chose to move across the country to start a tiny tech service business while working at a diner to pay my rent. He officially disowned me. He didn't cut me off financially because he'd never actually given me anything of my own. He just stopped speaking to me entirely, except for the occasional holiday phone call where he'd remind me how embarrassed he was to tell his colleagues what I was doing with my life. For 10 years, I lived in the shadows of his disappointment. I worked 80-hour weeks, teaching myself how to code, how to build infrastructure, and eventually, how to disrupt the very medical tech industry he reigned over. I didn't use the Sterling name. I used my mother's maiden name and started a company called Argent Systems. I lived on ramen and slept in a cramped studio apartment for years, all while my father was giving interviews to Forbes about the importance of legacy and intellectual pedigree. He had no idea that Argent Systems was becoming a powerhouse. He had no idea that the uneducated daughter he mocked was actually the CEO of a company that was currently outbidding his own firm for government contracts. I kept my face out of the press, using a COO as the public front of the company because I wasn't ready for the world, or my father, to know who was behind the curtain. I wanted to build something that was mine, untainted by his ego or his influence. Meanwhile, Julian would call me once a year just to gloat about his new Porsche or the latest gala they were attending. He'd say things like, "Dad's really worried about you, Maya. He saw a girl who looked like you at a bus stop the other day, and it ruined his whole dinner. Why don't you just apologize and go back to school? Maybe he can get you a job in the mailroom." I'd just sigh, tell him I was doing fine, and go back to managing a 300-person team. The turning point came 6 months ago. Richard's foundation, the Sterling Hope Initiative, took a massive hit. A series of bad investments and a minor scandal involving one of his board members left the foundation on the brink of collapse. They needed a $50 million infusion just to keep their medical research wings open. Richard was desperate. His entire identity was tied to this foundation. If it folded, his legacy was gone. He started reaching out to every venture capital firm and private donor in the country. My company, Argent, was the only one with the liquid capital and the strategic interest to bail him out. I saw the proposal hit my desk and I felt a chill run down my spine. This was it. I could either let him crash and burn, or I could save the very man who called me worthless. I decided to do both. I instructed my lawyers to set up a massive anonymous donation, but it came with a very specific set of strings. The anonymous donor would be the guest of honor at the annual gala, and they would have the right to address the board and the guests before the final papers were signed. Richard was so relieved to have the money that he agreed to everything without a second thought. He didn't even ask who the donor was. He just assumed it was some tech billionaire who wanted to rub elbows with him. In the weeks leading up to the gala, Richard actually called me. It was the first time he'd reached out in over a year. I thought for a second that maybe, just maybe, he was calling to reconcile because he was feeling humbled by his recent failures. But I was wrong. He called to tell me that I wasn't invited to the gala. He said, "Maya, this is the most important night of my life. The donor is someone of immense stature, and frankly, I don't want you there embarrassing me. You don't have the clothes, you don't have the conversation skills, and I don't want to explain to my peers why my daughter is a waitress. Please, just stay in your little apartment and I'll send you some money for Christmas." I sat there in my office, looking at the city skyline from the top floor of my building, and I just smiled. I told him, "Don't worry, Dad. I'll make sure I'm nowhere near you." He hung up, satisfied that he'd put me in my place. But little did he know, I had already bought the table at the very back of the room under a corporate name. I spent $5,000 on a dress that looked like a shadow, and I hired a professional makeup artist to make me look just different enough that he wouldn't recognize me from across a crowded, dim room. The night of the gala arrived. The ballroom was dripping in gold and crystals. Everyone who was anyone in the industry was there. I sat at my table, nursing a glass of water, watching my father work the room. He looked older, more stressed, but his arrogance was still fully intact. When it came time for the speeches, he stood up on that stage and began his address. He talked about the sanctity of excellence and how success is a choice made by those with the mental fortitude to grasp it. Then he took a sharp turn into personal territory. He started talking about the burdens of leadership and the tragedy of those who refuse to better themselves. He didn't name me, but everyone in our social circle knew who he was talking about. He said, "I have seen firsthand what happens when one chooses the path of the uneducated. I have a daughter who chose the life of a servant over the life of a scholar, and while it breaks my heart, it serves as a reminder that we cannot save everyone. Some people are simply worthless to the progress of society." The room went silent. It was a cruel, unnecessary jab, meant to make him look like a long-suffering martyr of a father. So that is the situation I was in. I was sitting 10 feet away from the man who raised me, listening to him call me a worthless servant in front of the most powerful people in the city, all while I held the check that would save his entire life's work in my evening bag. I had a choice to make. I could stay quiet, take the money back, and let him go bankrupt, or I could go through with the plan. Before I tell you what happened when I stood up and walked toward that stage, I want you to pause right now and comment below. What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have walked out and let him lose everything, or would you have stayed to make sure he knew exactly who was saving him? I'm reading all the comments, so let me know. I stood up. The chair scraped against the floor, a sharp sound in the quiet room. I didn't rush. I walked slowly, the heels of my shoes clicking on the marble floor like a countdown. As I approached the stage, Richard's eyes found me. At first, there was just confusion. He saw a well-dressed woman approaching the podium, and he probably thought I was an assistant or a late-arriving board member. But as I got closer, as I stepped into the bright stage lights, I saw the moment the recognition hit him. His face went from a smug mask of pride to a pale, ghostly white. The microphone was still live. I reached out, and with a smile that didn't reach my eyes, I gently took it from his shaking hand. I looked out at the audience, at the cameras, and at my brother Julian, who looked like he was about to vomit. I said into the mic, "My father is right about one thing. Success is a choice, but he's wrong about who gets to make it." I turned to look him directly in the eye. "Hi, Dad. I'm the uneducated daughter you were just talking about. I'm also the CEO of Argent Systems, the woman who just signed the $50 million grant to save this foundation. I've spent the last decade building a company that is currently worth triple what yours is, all while you were busy telling the world I was a failure." You could have heard a pin drop. Richard tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but nothing came out. I continued. I came here tonight to sign the final paperwork. But after hearing how you truly feel about the person saving your legacy, I've realized something. You talk a lot about worth, Richard. And I've decided that you and this foundation aren't worth my time or my money. The offer is withdrawn. I pulled the unsigned contract out of my bag, tore it in half right there in front of the cameras, and let the pieces flutter to the stage floor. The room erupted into chaos. Reporters started shouting, board members were standing up in a panic, and my father actually collapsed into a chair, looking like he'd aged 20 years in 20 seconds. I walked off that stage without looking back. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Without the Argent funding, the Sterling Hope initiative folded within 3 months. Richard had to sell his estate, his car collection, and most of his assets just to cover the legal fees and debts. Julian's law firm didn't want the PR nightmare associated with his family, and he was asked to take an indefinite leave. As for me, my company's stock actually went up. People loved the story of the underdog daughter taking down the arrogant titan. I didn't do it for the fame, though. I did it because for the first time in my life, I wasn't the girl who was worthless. I was the woman who knew her own value, and I didn't need his permission to exist. Looking back, I realized that some people will never change unless they lose everything that gave them their false sense of superiority. My father's love was always conditional on my performance, but my success was built on my own resilience. I learned that you can't find your worth in the eyes of someone who is committed to seeing you as a failure. If you're going through something similar, just know that your lack of education, or your differences, are often the very things that will make you unstoppable if you just keep going. Like this video if you think I did the right thing by pulling the funding and standing up for myself. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of people finally getting the respect they deserve. And please, share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section. Did I go too far, or was this the perfect ending? I'll see you all in the next story.